Are different. Aye. All those opposed, motion passes. Public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time and make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person. Seeing no comments, we will start with unfinished business 24-11, zoning amendment creating ordinance number 868, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinance for Appendix A, Articles 5 and 6 to streamline temporary use and structure regulations. In our packet, we had a memo dated July 19th, 2024 from Community Development Director Harrington.
So I drink a lot of caffeine, so I'm going to go stand up there. So. Perfect. All right, so this is an update from the item that I presented to you from the corner with the mask and the bloody nose and the COVID the other month, so a little bit easier to communicate it to you this time. So it is action item 2411. We held the public hearing on this item at the last Planning Commission meeting, and it's relating to temporary uses and structures within the city of Saline. Kind of hard to read, but a high-level overview of kind of where we left it last time. So we're currently proposing to put temporary uses into 5 buckets. We currently have a lot of different definitions with a lot of different regulations. They're scattered throughout the code. But the first would be an outdoor display, and I'll show examples of all of these on the following slides. But it would be conducted by the principal user, meaning I own a small retail store and I'm showing my clothing outside my store for sale or for display. The purchase would be hopefully made inside. We can tweak that code if you'd like that to be more explicit. The second is a transient or a seasonal sale, which is a third party. I underline that because there was a question last time. Selling seasonal goods, whether that be produce like the stand over on North Ann Arbor right now, or the fireworks stands that come into our city every year, Christmas trees, or other goods of a similar nature on someone else's property. In addition to zoning approval, both in the proposed ordinance and in the current ordinance, they're required to get a separate business license from the city clerk as a solicitor or a transient merchant, which is the same license required for people who go door to door or who are operating a food truck within our community. The next one is all other outdoor sales. So this would be someone who's hosting a pop-up farmer's market on their own property as opposed to the city one, or an art fair or something of that nature. So these are sales that are not related to the principal user of the property. So it's not the retail store selling retail goods. It's perhaps Baker's Nook allowing an art merchant to sell goods and stuff on their property, or otherwise selling goods that they would not usually carry within their store. It's a minor distinction and probably won't come into play often, but kind of in keeping with where the current code is at. The next proposed use is an assembly or fundraising activity. Again, this is looking for things that are not sales, but could be a parking lot concert not hosted in a city property, or Reinhardt does an annual mini golf tournament on their property. Things of that nature aren't necessarily selling a good, aren't necessarily using their property for a typical purpose, but hosting an event in their parking lot or in their green space otherwise. And then lastly are all other temporary uses. although our regulations related to sales and assembly or fundraising activities are pretty broad enough and deliberately broad to capture most activities, this would be anything else. And the Presbyterian Church is in attendance tonight, but they do an annual event for Ash Wednesday. That would be another great example of a temporary use that doesn't neatly fit into one of those categories, but it still provides the city the same review authority of those two other activities and just ensures that they're being conducted in an orderly manner. Again, giving more permissions than what currently exists under the code rather than less. So this would be an example of an outdoor display. I pulled all these quickly from Google Images, so forgive me for not citing my sources properly. But as you can see, it's a shoe store with a table selling shoes outside, similar to racks of clothes outside. If you were at the art fair, Ragstock had their own little racks outside of their building this weekend. Transient or seasonal sale, this is very similar to the stand that's currently on North Ann Arbor. Again, selling produce, items of a seasonal nature. They have a little bit more protections in our code given Saline's rural heritage, but also given the nature of these sales lasting usually over a longer period of time than a typical pop-up display or a weekend event. This is all other outdoor sales. No idea where this is, no idea what they're selling, but again, kind of showing a parking lot with pop-up tents, kind of what these typically look like. Assembly or fundraising activities. There's something from like this Texas State Fairgrounds from 1950, which I thought was interesting, but they're probably selling things, but nevertheless holding an event, cornhole, concert, whatever it might be. And then I pulled the poster that Reinhardt had from their putt-putt event last year as another example. Moving on, other high-level overview of what's really been proposed to change in the code are related to tents, specifically those over 200 square feet. There's some loose language in the code already regulating tent sizes and the need for temporary certificate of occupancy. But if you were at City Hall anytime Thursday through Saturday, the residents immediately across the street had a really large wedding tent, and we asked them to get a temporary certificate of occupancy. The reason being is those tents are massive wind loads, so if they're not anchored properly, they do pose a threat to public safety. I don't think most people really take that into account when they're setting up a tent for someone's graduation party or for a parking lot sale, but especially in parking lots where there's not really an easy way to anchor them, it's really important that someone's looked at it to make sure that it's going to stay in place and not kind of take off and fly away like those bounce house videos you've probably seen on Instagram or whatever apps you use. Importantly, the tents are limited to 72 hours of use unless otherwise approved as part of a transient or seasonal sale or a temporary use. That's currently within the code already, but something that I think worth reestablishing as a city. We don't want tents up for an extended period of time. Moving on to updates made from the last review. So we had the proposed ordinance we discussed last time. I got some feedback from you. I didn't receive any written feedback. But we removed language allowing the PC, the Planning Commission, to hear appeals of staff decisions on temporary events. So if the staff rejects one, their remedy would be to go to the ZBA, is how that is written in our code. The ZBA is acting as a judge or a judicial body more often than not, so it makes sense for it to belong to them rather than perhaps the Planning Commission, although we can revert back if we need. But that's the remedy to contest any zoning decision. There are clear requirements to state the expected number of attendees at a proposed temporary use and then demonstrate available parking for attendees. I also presented this briefly to the policy subcommittee of the City Council, and that was something that they had kind of honed in on, but similar to some of the feedback I heard from all of you. We corrected an accidental omission relating to the permitting requirements and reviews for transient and seasonal sales, and then per the request of the Planning Commission, cut the duration of such sales from 120 days to 90 days. We reduced the occurrence of temporary sales by non-principal users, so those pop-up art fairs, whatever you want to call them, from unlimited amount per year to 8 per year, and we were requiring 5 days between sales rather than 3. Again, this is all up for negotiation. I'm not tied to any of these numbers. And then additionally, we removed the allowance for them in the PB and OS districts. Similarly, for assembly and fundraising activities, we reduced it from 12 allowances per year to 6. Requires 14 days between any other temporary use in this type of event. So it's not just between another assembly activity, but it'll also be 14 days between any type of sale. Sales in conjunction, which was a pretty common occurrence if you're having an outdoor market or an outdoor concert, they usually kind of go hand in hand. Again, if you have a sale in conjunction with an assembly or fundraising activity, it kind of counts for both. So you don't get the benefit of having a sale with a fundraising activity and then have 8 other sales essentially. if we can, I'll take you through again the broad changes. So it's a citywide change. It's like other ordinances. It doesn't usurp private deed agreements or development agreements or leases, which is particularly important for some of these commercial parking lots where they might have regulations that prohibit people from hosting an event in their parking lot. Again, we just went over the tense, but we've added broad review authority with this proposed ordinance. This has remained the same from the last version I showed you. For the principal users selling items they regularly sell inside their store, again, this is all the information I showed you last time. But importantly, as Planning Commissioner and Councilmember Gearbaugh had asked, items cannot be placed in parking spaces for more than 48 hours. That's a current provision in the code and one that we'll reinforce here. So it would not permit people from essentially keeping items in their parking spaces in perpetuity, which was a question about access and use of this property, use of the property. For transient and seasonal sale, we just cut down to allow them, and the SPA1, the I1, the I2, no longer the PB or the OS. As I mentioned in my memo to you, there was a question at the last meeting about whether a business selling a seasonal item would fall into this category and whether they could then display that product in their parking lot. The answer is not really. That transient or seasonal sale requires the third party to take effect, requires them to be separately licensed by the clerk. So really it's meant to narrowly tailor to people who sell a very seasonal item and are operating kind of independent of the store that they're selling with. For all other outdoor sales, it's remained the same. The proposed ordinance increases the city's review authority. It allows more sales in districts, which would add to the I1 and I2, but again, we've scrapped the PB and OS allowance. It has clearer permitting requirements. It requires a principal user to be the applicant. We talked about this at the last meeting, but I think it's important to kind of hit on again. The owner of a property is not necessarily the one eligible to apply and receive permission to do this activity. It has to be a business on site that's given permission, and that kind of prevents some of our absentee landlords of the city from selling items or from selling out their parking lot from their users. A user has to take local accountability for these types of events. They do not have to be conducted by or in support of a nonprofit, which is a current clause in our current ordinance. I'm not exactly sure how we would even go about enforcing that specific clause. If a dollar donation to the Saline Schools Foundation would be sufficient for that, that discrepancy isn't really identified in our ordinance. So I think it's better just to kind of stay out of the purpose and intent of it. Like I said, we limited it to 8 occurrences per year when it was previously unlimited. And then we added the additional 2 days between sales that would be required. However, again, we can talk about that too. Currently, there are arbitrary size requirements about the linear feet that a sale can occupy and the square footage. Different properties will have different needs, both larger and smaller. So I think it makes sense to just review these as police, as fire, as DPW, and as community development on a case-by-case basis. And then for any past nuisances caused by the applicant, the property owner, et cetera, the vendors themselves, the city can refuse issuance of a permit. So we talked about outdoor sales. Garage sales are currently allowed in the city. We're not proposing any changes there. So moving on to assembly and fundraising activities, pretty similar. Broad review authority, allowed in more districts. Clearer permitting requirements, requires the principal user. They don't have to be conducted for the purposes of a nonprofit, although fundraising kind of inherently applies that. We're increasing the allotment from 4 times in a calendar year to 6 times. Importantly, that 4 times a year is really only applying to properties that are institutional users, so churches. So this not only expands the zoning districts, but then expands the number allowed per year. The sale aspect of the current code allows 2 for private property users. Sales are in conjunction are okay, but must be noted and they count against. And then the new change for 14 days between this type and any other type of temporary use on the property. And residential properties holding a graduation party, a small wedding reception, whatever it might be, are subject to city nuisance standards, but they're kind of exempt from this aspect of the code because it's not really meant for them. But if they're occupying street parking, if they're being noisy, if they're causing too much light pollution, et cetera, we have nuisance codes for a reason that we would then enforce. So the overarching considerations for the Planning Commission are the Planning Commission okay with a revised proposal to allow transient seasonal sales, temporary outdoor sales, and assembly events in the I1 and I2 zoning districts, having noted that the professional business and office service are next? Is the Planning Commission comfortable with the level of discretion given to city departments? Do you have any concerns with the allowed frequency or duration of events? And are there other specific questions or concerns you have looking through this ordinance? As opposed to last time, I did remove two of the questions, one of which is, are you okay with the ordinance being updated? Because I feel like we landed on a yes with that one. And then similar for the fireworks, whether or not it was okay marking them as a special land user. We've talked about the nuisances that they've caused, not only for my department and my staff, but the police department and the fire department as well as the clerk, to be honest with you. So I think we landed on a yes with that as well, but if I was mistaken, please let me know. And if you're okay with the ordinance, I'd recommend that you recommend to the City Council Subcommittee, Policy Subcommittee adoption, which I believe is reflected on your agenda. And if not, if you'd like to see modifications, just provide us clear instructions and we will get going on those. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, questions for Community Development Director Harrington?
Can I just ask one question? On the temporary uses, this one is the one that seems like there's no set outside limit for like how long that can, some final limit, whereas like in the seasonal one, there's like an outside limit of 90 days, and then in the garage, garage sales and the assemblies, there's like some sort of outside limit. Is there a reason for just not having one sort of outside limit there?
Can I interrupt real quick, because I'm getting flagged down by our audiovisual director. Could you pull that microphone just a little bit closer to you?
Sorry.
Yep, no, you're good.
Oh, yeah. Is there a reason why there's no outside limit in the temporary use section versus some of the other sections?
Yeah, so for the temporary uses, the outdoor sales by a non-principal user have that section. So it's a subsection of temporary use and then assembly and fundraising. But yes, you're right. On the broad overview of temporary uses, there is no finite cap, which might be a change we want to make. I would imagine that most would fall under one or two, and that a temporary user outside those two classifications would be kind of rare. But I can see the purpose of adding an overall cap to the number of temporary uses on a property within a year. Is that something that the rest of the Planning Commission would support too, just to kind of close a potential loophole?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to tap into that, because I know when we talk about 6 and 8, I'd like to see consistency on the number of occurrences, but also that cap that you're mentioning. Just so we don't have something that gets confusion when you have 6 versus 8 versus 4. We should just stick to like 6 for everything.
Additional questions?
Yeah, Ben, the one thing I had sent to you was examples of those. They're not tents, but they're structures made out of plastic tubing that people store their cars under. So what's the definition of a canopy versus a tent versus some other structure that isn't 4 poles or poles and stakes?
Yeah, so my tent definition in this was a shortening of it. The code calls it a portable tent structure, something that is that is movable pretty easily. What the items that you sent me, I would describe as effectively permanent structures, likely not built to a code. And it's an accessory structure as well. So it needs to be reviewed for footings. It needs to be reviewed for setbacks. I would consider all of the things you sent me effectively permanent structures, meaning they would have to comply with our accessory use, our accessory building and structure standards, which are somewhat separate from all of this, because again, it's implying that it's permanent. So those ones need to be reviewed for whether or not they were ever actually given a permit. So I'll have to find the specific addresses and then kind of evaluate from there.
Okay, because right now you're seeing a lot of different structures that are either made out of plastic pipes, or they have a pole, or they have, because I've done those, even we have 3 or 4 different types of examples when we use them at the farm. So I just want to make sure that those are all covered and that somebody doesn't say, well, I have a canopy. It isn't underneath, it doesn't count as a tent. So just making
Right. So
of what of all those items are.
right, and the portable tent structure too, we could enforce the duration limit there. It says you can have it for 72 hours. So if you're really claiming that what you're using as a permanent carport is really only there for a temporary basis, then it should be down in 3 days. But in most of the events, from the pictures you sent me at least, they were very much permanent structures that had wear and tear shown on them.
Additional questions or comments?
I move to acknowledge receipt of the memo dated July the 19th.
I'll second that. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion to open the public hearing at 7:21 PM?
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. All public comments will be heard, a limit of 3 minutes per person.
Seeing no one in the audience, having an open meeting point, please move to close.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Additional comments and questions from Planning Commission members? Hey, Ben, can we have the PowerPoint back up on the screen, next to the last slide? Thank you, sir. All right, there are questions, considerations for the Planning Commission members. Is the Planning Commission okay with the revised proposal to allow the transient seasonal sales, temporary outdoor sales, and assembly events in the I-1 and I-2 zones, nixing professional business and office service?
Yes.
Okay, so any additional opinions about that? So Ben, let's go with yes for allowing an I-1 and I-2. Is the Planning Commission comfortable with the level of discretion for the condition review given to the city departments? I think keeping it consistent with DPW, fire, community development, I think it's plain and simple. It's black and white. We're reviewing this, and that's it. Does anybody else have strong opinions either way?
I mean, we'll see what happens. If we need to address that, we'll move it forward. I mean, we've had some issues with some enforcement and other things, so it's always a difficulty of enforcement versus actually the discretion at which you guys do your stuff. So it's more what happens on the weekends when somebody doesn't follow when you guys aren't here. So, but I think it's fine at this point in time.
Additional questions, comments? Nope. Does the Planning Commission have any concern with the allowed frequency duration of the events? I know Mr. Gearbaugh has said about 6 versus 8. Maybe we should have a consistent number that we allow. Let's have some discussion about that. I mean, I like keeping it pretty consistent. Then we can say it's being reviewed. We're allowing this many, but that's just how I feel, again, black and white. Any other comments?
Yeah, because I mean, 8 was a random compromise. I think 6 is consistent with the other assembly one, so then both sales and assemblies are exactly the same.
Well, right, and I think one option to Commissioner LaForte's point is we could just create an overarching temporary use that caps the total amount of uses. So whether it's a sale or an assembly activity, the city's ambivalent, but you're allowed 6 such events a year.
And I like the consistency in that, so I would encourage you to move forward with that change. And are there other specific concerns or questions that you have looking through the ordinance? No? I like the revisions that you made and appreciate you incorporating our comments from the last meeting, as sick as you were. So,
My ears still worked. So just to be clear, we're good with the number 6 as the overall cap for all temporary uses, sales, assembly, doesn't matter. You get 6 a year.
yes. All right. Any additional comments, questions, discussion? All right, if seeing none, is there a motion to recommend to the Saline City Council Policy Subcommittee to adopt or not adopt the new ordinance number 868, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinance for Appendix A, Articles 5 and 6, to streamline temporary use and structure regulations?
Moved.
To recommend and adopt or not adopt?
Oh, to recommend and to adopt.
Any additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. New business, 24-13, application from Dr. Mitchell M. Road of Just a Fuse LLC for a final site plan to establish a private club workshop in an existing commercial building located on a 0.38 acre site at 7641 North Ann Arbor Street, Saline, Michigan, 48176, parcel numbers 18-13-36-428-017. In our packet, we have a memo dated July 18th from Community Development Director Harrington, a report dated July 17th from Planner Auerbach, and a memo dated July 10th from OHM Engineer Boss.
Okay, well, I made an error on my title, cited as a final site plan, not a preliminary. Rest assured, the rest of the presentation is accurate, but it is action item 2413. Preliminary was 2406, I want to say, for Just a Fuse LLC. For Autos is the proposed business. So the current property is on the eastern side of Ann Arbor Saline Road, adjacent to Brecken Village and Sheffield Condos, Brecken Village being on the west, Sheffield Condos to the east. There we go. The former Saline picture frame shop was the tenant of this building. It's annexed into the city last September. It was adjacent to other island properties to the south that were under Lodi Township's jurisdiction, so they were islands within the city, essentially. It is currently zoned office service, OS. Preliminary site plan was approved by the Planning Commission at the May 8th, 2024 meeting, and they received ZBA approval for some variances at the June 6th, 2024 meeting. This kind of goes off the preliminary discussion that we had here about the green belt, about setbacks, about parking lot dimensions and stormwater and how all those things play together. So the ZBA heard their case and found that the applicant faced practical difficulty. They granted a variance for the drive aisle maneuvering lane to be 16 feet when 24 feet is regularly required, for parking spaces to be 18 feet long when 20 feet is regularly required, the parking area to be set back 3.8 feet from the south or side property line when 5 feet is typically required, the parking area to be set back 9.5 and 10 feet from the west front property line when 25 feet is typically required. The variance approvals are based on future users requiring the same or fewer parking spaces, which at this point in time is 10. An increase in parking requirement from a new user would require them to receive new variances for these dimensional setback issues, or sorry, for the dimensional issues. The substandard parking spaces along the southern property line shall be marked as compact only at the discretion of the Planning Commission during final site plan review. It's currently shown on the applicant's site plan as one standalone sign. However, if you'd like to see individual striping or individual signage, the ZBA left that to your discretion by a chance of providing this variance to the applicant. So the Planning Commission is reviewing a final site plan where you review a finalized site plan based on zoning requirements, general concept, and engineering evaluation. The proposal is to convert the space, which is currently vacant, into a private workshop and private club to use antique arcade machines. Antique to me, maybe not to you all. It has a reconfiguration of parking lot and driveway entrance, removal of dumpster, and the building footprint is proposed to remain unchanged with siding material and signage changes. So it's the same elevation you saw on the preliminary plan. It's going to have a metal finish and a sign out front. They're adding additional glazing or windows on the front of the building to kind of give it a more welcoming vibe, I guess is the right word to use here. This is the existing parking lot layout. So as you can see, the parking lot goes directly into the street. As Dr. Rohde has pointed out, our police department really likes to use it for speed traps because it's really convenient. You just roll in and you roll out. This was the first proposed parking lot layout. So again, showing the parking lot built up to the street. This is what we looked at the preliminary site plan phase. The Planning Commission asked the applicant to reduce impervious surfaces, not only for the benefit of stormwater, but to also create a greenbelt buffer. The applicant did that. They created about 9.5 feet on the northern end of the drive entrance and about 10 feet on the southern to add more space, more green space especially. And that was about halfway to the 25-foot typically required setback. So they're bringing the site into more conformity, although it would still be non-conforming. And the variances were granted for that setback to exist. The applicant submitted this landscape plan to begin with, so not much on the way of the greenbelt because the greenbelt didn't exist at the time of the preliminary site plan. But the new landscaping plan calls for 2 trees to be planted along Ann Arbor Street. And we'll get into the specific issues of landscaping or lack thereof shortly. So the Planning Commission reviews the final site plan and approves with or without conditions based on the specific objectives, requirements of the City of Saline ordinances and standard specifications, looking at that list of fun things that we've been over so many times. But primarily in this case, landscaping, signs, engineering reviews, and then parking and loading. So with Planner Auerbach and MC Mortiz from OHM, we kind of identified 3 key areas to bring to your attention. So for signs, the applicant needs to confirm whether or not the existing monument sign is proposed to remain. So our understanding at the preliminary phase that the monument sign was to be removed, and that was in my first PowerPoint to you all, as opposed as a claim of how it's becoming more within the residential character required of properties within the office service district. The applicant must also provide a comprehensive sign plan showing that their proposed signage, specifically the autos on the front of the building, meets the city code requirement for signage. For parking and loading, the Planning Commission must determine if the 19 spaces proposed are appropriate when only 10 spaces are required. The first proposal was 21. They've since reduced to 19 on account of adding a green belt and doing some other dimensional changes in that parking lot. And then lastly, for landscaping, the proposed access drive is, okay, I did not fix that slide. So for landscaping, we can just hop on to the next slide. The Planning Commission could require the applicant to install a formal wall structure to shield the parking area from the street. So if my laser pointer will work or not work because it's a LED screen, but essentially in the northwestern portion of the lot where the two ADA spots are, you can, in theory, require a wall to go all the way down the length of the property on Ann Arbor Street. The code provides for the Planning Commission to make that requirement. The applicant can also offset it with landscaping that you deem sufficient. So if you believe that those 3 trees are sufficient for the purpose of screening the parking lot, then the applicant need not make any changes, but you could require a small wall to exist. You could require additional bushes or hedges to exist. Talking with Planner Auerbach shortly before this meeting, we're rather ambivalent on what that exactly is, but it's something for you all to consider and your preference for how you want to see this corridor developed. As I added in my report, most other businesses on this street in this area, whether it's the 3 dentists immediately nearby or Cascade Apartments, have not installed a wall structure to shield their parking areas up to this point. However, most of them have not had a recent site plan review. So if it is something you would request the applicant to do, just looking forward, it's something you should continue for other properties that develop on North Ann Arbor Street to screen their parking areas with a wall. For the number of parking spaces, we're pretty indifferent. We approved 21 at the last meeting. It's now reduced to 19. Provided that they're marked in a way that you deem appropriate for the compact only on the southern end of that property. There's no issue from staff. And then for signs, the applicant does need to indicate whether or not that existing monument sign is staying. If it is, it's likely going to trigger non-conforming aspects with our code when they choose to install new signage on it, which would require it to be brought within compliance of city setbacks anyways. The applicant then also just needs to submit a comprehensive site plan showing conformity with the city's sign code for both whether or not they maintain a monument sign and then whatever signage they place on the building. So again, this is that revised landscaping plan showing the current landscaping and really looking at the border with Ann Arbor Street and whether or not that is sufficient for your interests with the property being screened from the road. So it is my recommendation that you move to approve the final site plan application for Just a Fuse LLC for 7641 North Ann Arbor Road with the following 5 conditions. The first is the standard one that the approval is valid for 365 days. And then if they pull a building permit, they have 365 days to begin construction before needing to seek a formal extension. The second is that the applicant should provide that comprehensive sign plan. The third is to provide a calculation demonstrating that at least 10% of the site area is landscaped, excluding any greenbelt and/or parking lot landscaping and public rights-of-way. It's just a small aspect of our code. I have no doubt the applicant can meet it. The fourth is that the outside trash disposal containers shall be screened according to section 7.029, just meaning they can't be in the front of the building, which the applicant said in the preliminary site plan that they would do, but just adding as an additional condition here. And then 5, that the applicant shall address the items for a construction plan review called out in OHM's submitted report dated July 10th, 2024. As a note, if you didn't look at that report, there are pretty minor asks to just change the format of the calculations and to confirm that some of the numbers are accurate, but there are no concerns raised by OHM at this time that the applicant would not be able to meet the stormwater standards agreed to ahead of time. That's all I have.
Great, thank you very much. Planner Auerbach, do you have anything to add that Mr. Harrington did not cover?
Sure, just some minor notes. The one location that's regarding landscaping that's up for further consideration is that one parking space on the north side of the new driveway. There are no plantings adjacent between that space and the roadway. There are some smaller shrubs and trees on the space on the south side, not on the north. So again, you have the discretion to require some additional plantings or even that wall if you deem appropriate. And the condition about the dumpster enclosure, like we discussed last time, the applicant indicated they're only using dumpsters, but that's just as much for future potential tenants or users of the property as it is for them.
Great, thank you very much. Questions or comments? Yes, Mr. Mayor.
I just have one for Mr. Harrington. Condition 1, as outlined in your presentation, that's enumerated on the agenda. Why is that necessary? Isn't it just a matter of policy that you have 6 months for a preliminary site plan and 1 year for final?
Yeah, we started adding that because when we send out an action letter is what I usually refer to when I'm talking to people, 8 months after the fact, saying, well, what were my conditions again? So we're just putting all the basic conditions on the action letter. It's not necessarily a condition. It's inherent to the approval in our ordinance that it's only valid for 365 days, but it's really for the applicant's benefit when they look back at that action letter to realize, what is my timeline? This has been a specific issue with some of the dispensaries that we had that, feigned ignorance. And again, it's in our ordinance, so we're protected, but I think it just goes further to demonstrating.
Trying to provide some clarity for the petitioner.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's all I had. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Additional questions or comments?
Can I ask just like two questions? One, is just a point of confusion that I have, which is, it said here that, it says that the variance approvals are based on future use requiring the same or few parking spots, 10. But they're looking for 19, and it says, so I'm confused as to, they got a variance to make the parking spots smaller and more, and, you know, but this is, the variance is based on there being still only 10 parking spots?
Right, so we have a parking, off-street parking requirement table that applicants are expected to meet. So he was being classified as a private club, which has a specific calculation for the number of spaces the city will require you to provide. Most other uses have a higher requirement. So for a retail store, it's like 1 per 150 or 100 square feet, which is quite high. I mean, that would be like 30 spaces required. So it's going off our own ordinance language. The applicant is providing a surplus of parking as far as the city is concerned, providing 19 when 10 would otherwise be required.
Okay, so it's, because it just, the increase kind of threw me off, so an increase in part, but it's requirements, not necessarily what they're offering.
Exactly.
Okay. The other question I have is, it looks like from there, then all spaces other than the 2 ADA spaces are all compact. Is that correct?
Right, so we are less concerned, at least I am less concerned about the ones that are not within the building envelope. So the handful to the east and the handful to the west of the building structure. But it's the one where you have the 16-foot drive aisle, and immediately behind you is not more pavement, it is the structure itself. So those are the spaces that we are most concerned about being marked as compact only, so that the applicant is signing to visitors that these spots are really difficult to maneuver if you don't have a very small car.
Are there spots to the east?
There are a handful to the east of the envelope of the building.
Okay, all right, okay. And so most of them are, so there are some that are not labeled compact?
Right, that I would say do not necessarily have to be labeled compact only, and going off what the ZBA had approved. Chair Young, were you at that meeting?
I was not.
Okay, so what the ZBA had approved was really concerning those spots that fell within the envelope of the building, because the consequence for backing up too far is backing into the building versus, you know, kind of going into the area where the applicant might store his bins, or going in front of the building where the ADA spots would be.
I see, okay, understood, thank you.
Additional questions or comments?
Ben, you had mentioned the sign, or the monument sign out front and everything, and I'm just having to look at it right now. What would change to make it, is it in compliant right now with what's there, or is it too tall, is it too wide?
My understanding is that it's too close to the right-of-way, would be first, but then we would have to review the sizing aspect of the height and the overall square footage, because the OS district is a slightly more prohibitive than our general commercial or industrial districts, as it, again, it's supposed to have more of a residential feel to it.
Right. So as long as it doesn't change from what it is and kind of stays within it, we're allowing it as a non-conforming use at this point?
No, so that's a confusion. So it would have, if the applicant intends on keeping it, which was not my understanding at the preliminary, and again, it was on the slides, then there's going to be some negotiation there to bring it into conformity with city standards, because our non-conforming ordinance would require it to be brought in, because it's been an abandoned sign without the operation publicly of the Saline Picture Frame Shop.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify to make sure that was the issue, so it's not a non-conforming use. It really needs to come into compliance with existing.
Right, my report was slightly misleading on that front.
Okay.
Additional questions or comments?
I'll move to acknowledge receipt of the memos dated July the 18th, July the 1st, and July the 10th.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Applicant developer comments, limited to 10 minutes if you'd like to come up and speak.
Good to see everybody here again this evening. Thank you for having me. Great discussion. Thank you very much, Ben. If we could advance slide.
Oh, I have your clicker.
Oh. As many of you know, we've been making some pretty good progress over at Otto's. As you've driven by, I can guarantee we've done a lot of good things. We haven't made it in Aldi yet. Someone came in the other day and asked if we were making it Aldi's. So this is still planning for arcade games. We have a new roof. We have lots of overhangs. We have some wall updates and windows and doors and so on and so forth. And I think it's really shaping up. Obviously, the parking lot is our next big step, as well as the siding, gutters, and so on and so forth. And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. There were two main issues driving these site plan revisions, or the site revisions. One was, if you remember correctly, drainage, and the second was parking. As you see there on the right, when we had the big rain the other night, or about a week ago, that's what happened and where we've torn out the old kitchen. So it's the water that flows, instead of away from the building, it all flows toward the building and actually under the building. And so it's rotted some of the steel paneling on the outside, which is a real shame, but we're working on it. And so that's one of the reasons that we're here. As Ben did a great job here, Director Harrington, with the describing the site. A lot of this is pretty much review. This is the original site. This is the parking site plan after all the feedback and revisions that we received. Per the discussion we just had a minute ago, my plan was, though the architect had indicated, or the planners, or my team had put a sign out front there to indicate compact cars only, my plan was principally to put it in those spaces within the envelope of the building, because I don't see any necessarily reason to mark that on the other ones where there isn't really a problem pulling in and out for larger vehicles. But I'm happy to discuss that. As was mentioned, we got those variances approved with the ZBA last month. Thank you very much to the committee. The drainage design improved significantly from first pass till today. You can see we'll be putting in these large concrete cisterns below the parking lot, as well as piping that should help reduce the amount of water flowing out toward to the city in the near term and long term. It should handle everything. I know the engineering team is working on redoing the calculations per the feedback that we got. I don't know that they have it done today, but I know they're working on it, and it shouldn't be a problem. Appreciate the feedback on that. So I think drainage will be handled once we execute these changes. The landscaping went through a lot of revision, as was discussed. We got some great landscape architect to work on it. You can see that there's a lot of plantings. We can certainly talk about the front and whether it's necessary or not, or how much we want to do there. I just got to say, as a side note, I get very nervous about putting too many plantings in the front and things that block vision, because I pulled in and out of that parking lot many, many times. And North Ann Arbor Street can be a busy road at different times. And certainly I want to make sure whoever pulls in and out of the facility does not have any, there are no accidents as a result of me putting pretty bushes there. So, but we can certainly talk about that stuff. I observed in the notes for tonight's meeting that there was some concern or some question about the percentage of the lot that's covered with landscaping versus the non-percentage, and so I went and did a little clever diagram last night, and you can see that those sections A through H are the percentages of the lot that are landscaped. And so if you look at, and I didn't know in terms of the exclusion of which sections here are not related to the parking lot, but if you look at like sections E, D, and F alone, it far exceeds 10%. So it should be compliant with city requirements. Signage, I know there's a lot of question, and I'm glad I'm able to speak to this before we have too much discussion. My plan was to remove the monument sign. I took a look at it, and I was originally planning to keep something there or to try to bring it into compliance, but it's kind of tough, and I don't know that we really need it if we put an actual autos in the front of the building, and it's a little bit old school to have these signs out front. So my proposal is to remove the non-compliant sign entirely and just keep letters with some lighting atop the front and the front feature of the building there. And you can see that was in the original architectural diagram, and that's what the plan is now. I don't actually have a sign company contracted yet to create those letters, but it'll be somewhere along the line of what you see there. Just to summarize, I know this is pretty much beating a dead horse, but we're rehabilitating this aging building in the city of Saline. We're very proud of it. We're getting a lot of very positive feedback online and through calls and people stopping by the shop. I think it's going to be an asset. I think it's a fairly good plan, and I would love to make it move forward. I am happy to answer any questions for anybody.
Great,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much.
Yep.
Questions or comments for the applicant? Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Madam Chair, I would move to open the public hearing, affording the public an opportunity to speak to this issue at 7:46.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. All public comments will be heard, limit of 3 minutes per person. Seeing nobody in the audience, I will move to close the public comment period at 7:47.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Questions, comments from the Planning Commission members?
Just one quick one. When we talked about the site, I'm glad that Dr. Rhodes has mentioned that that sign will be removed, because that always has been a concern of being site. That one tree, the one that you have in front, do you think that will be an issue for driving out of there as it gets bigger?
It was kind of put in there as a requirement to comply with the code. I'll talk to the landscaper, we'll have to keep it trimmed, and I don't want to get anything, it's like the back of the lot. We didn't want to grow anything that was too tall, it's going to get into the electrical lines again, which seems to be a continuing problem.
Oh, that's right, okay.
So, we want to make sure that whatever we put up there is not super high maintenance and isn't going to cause troubles. But I do get concerned about the more plantings we put at the very front there, given the visibility stuff, the more we create visibility impediments for folks trying to look, left and right. So.
We also Googled the tree. So it's a trimmable tree. It's pretty narrow at its base, so.
Okay, no, that's fine. I just wanted, we had some kind of condition like that, because I know that has been an issue here with other trees. No longer a question, but really a statement. I would prefer not having a wall there. I think it's just another obstruction because of it's such a close setting there to the street that adding another wall would be just another thing. If it was a larger parking lot, whatever, I think that might concern me. The fact that we're just putting in green grass from where it was just asphalt all the way up to the road, I think has made a big significant improvement on this. So if my fellow members feel that that's something they would prefer, but from my perspective, I don't necessarily see that as a requirement at this point.
Just piggybacking on that, looking at the ADA compliant spots, there's hostas and daylilies going there, boxwoods around the back on the south side of the site. They will fill in. For the first couple of years, they're small, but, it will definitely fill in near the ADA spots. So I agree, no wall would probably be a good way to go. Mr. Morrow.
And I also concur, no wall, no additional landscaping. I have been a frequent patron of the former business that was on site for many years. And to Dr. Rhodes' point, there are some inherent challenges as you are both entering and exiting that parcel. There are some clear obstructions. It's a busy road, especially at peak times of the day. And I think additional landscape vegetation could exacerbate the problem. I know there were previous conversations about the parking. I believe that the 19 spaces that are provided in the most recent renderings are more than sufficient. I think there will be occasions, rare occasions, but there will be occasions where people will probably need to park on the adjacent streets. But I suspect, based on what the applicant has articulated this evening and in the past, 90, 95, 98% of the time, what is provided will be more than sufficient. So I think this is a good plan. This site is because it was annexed into the city, because it was developed many decades ago, there are some inherent challenges, but I think what's proposed is solid and good for the community, and I'm ready to move forward with approval.
Additional questions or comments? Is there a motion on the table to approve, not approve, or approve with conditions the final site plan to renovate an existing commercial building to create a private club workshop at 7641 Ann Arbor Street, Saline, Michigan 48176? There are 5 conditions enumerated in the memo.
The only other item we need clarification on is the marking of those compact spots, if you prefer the one shown in the plan, which was a sign for all of it, or if Dr. Rhodes' proposal to mark them individually. I guess that wasn't clear if there's signage, pavement markings, whatever the preference is, just.
I don't think we need them on all 16 spots. That would be confusing.
Right, no, I agree. I think the envelope of the envelope of the building is probably the best. I prefer Dr. Rhodes shown, but it's just a matter of a pavement marking or individual signs if the planning commission has a preference.
I'm fine with individual ones in the, what is it, 6 or 8 spots? That would be very clear, because when you drive into it, you're going to see it.
Okay.
And you don't have to repaint them every 2 or 3 years on the asphalt.
Perfect.
Excellent. Is there a mover?
I'll move it with the conditions as identified.
Second. Any additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Discussion items. Number 1, downtown renderings.
Ben, do you want to put up that set of slides?
Thank you, Dr. Rode.
Thank you.
Perfect. So this is just a discussion item. The renderings that were produced in front of you are part of a MISTA Housing Readiness Initiative. It's not an initiative, it's another I word, but it's a grant that MISTA provided the city of about $40,000 to accomplish a variety of things. The first item you saw was the PUD ordinance at your last meeting. This is kind of the next batch, is to look at our downtown form-based code and see if people built what we're allowing today by right, if that would really be the type of development we want to see downtown, or if not, what changes should we really be making to the code? So it's a very conceptual exercise. I unfortunately gave the Presbyterian Church a little bit of a heart attack when they saw the renderings and thought that they were building a new church. So I'm glad that they're in attendance tonight, so we can kind of redo this in a little bit more of a collaborative way. But again, it's really to see, are the city's standards as they are now adequate for downtown development? Are there changes that need to occur? And those changes, as well as a little bit more of form diagrams within our code, kind of showing the facades and things that we're looking for, are covered by the grant. So Planner Auerbach will be assisting and kind of taking some of the feedback I got at the council meeting, as well as at this meeting, and maybe making some small or minor tweaks to our downtown code. So to go through a couple of sites, this one is the Gunther property. It used to be La Fontaine or some other car dealership that I can't remember the name of. It's brownfield. We know that there are some gas canisters that were buried on site that have since leached a little bit, so it will be eligible for brownfield funding and potentially a very transformative development for the city downtown. It's currently zoned D2, which is our less dense of our two downtown form-based codes, D1 being core, D2 being edge. So on the edge, you would expect to see some of these townhome structures. So this is the first rendering of what those townhomes would potentially look like. Alternatively, looking at the Gunther site, if you built to the D1, you're looking at these more dense, about 45-foot tall buildings. They're white box, but you'd probably imagine a brick or a vinyl facade to them. And this zoomed out perspective is meant to kind of show you scale. What is it going to be taller than that's nearby? One of the things that I kind of glommed onto are the steeples of the churches, that at 45 feet, all of our buildings will still be lower than the steeples of the churches that kind of define the downtown Saline corridor. You can also see in the back behind the buildings, although it's kind of faint, there's some parking area. Sorry, then I'll get back to the mic. There's a large parking surface lot behind that goes into that property that then extends onto Henry Street. So the expectation is that they would probably have to provide some of their own parking, although our code is very flexible with downtown parking, acknowledging that the city owns parking as well. This is a little bit closer, again, of that street view of what these buildings would look like. As you can see, they're probably at scale with the existing buildings because of the topography slope. They really show below the buildings that are technically smaller than it, which are the 109, the 107, 105, et cetera. My phone is ringing. Moving on, you can see this was Hall Street and McKay Street. So what you're looking at here is the Presbyterian Church in the top right corner. McKay, so City Hall, is just the avenue right down that you can see right through that window. And this is looking, and these are all D1 buildings on Hall. What it would look like if those houses, the Prayer Garden, the surface parking lot, were redeveloped by right under the current code by anyone who would buy those properties from the Presbyterian Church or potentially the Kinley family that owns that surface parking lot. They could build structures that look very much like this. Potentially looking at reevaluating how McKay Street operates. So again, looking directly out that window up behind Trinity Evangelical, again, a higher vision of density. These are properties that are adjacent to our downtown, similar to Henry Street, but they don't have the historic significance or historic longevity of those homes on Henry Street, which are much older and have a lot more ties to the community. Again, this is what it looks like at the street level. It's still going to be smaller than the steeple of the Presbyterian Church. Really not as tall or as intimidating as I think people might think 45 feet or 35 feet is when you look at it. Moving on to another corridor of our city that's not often talked about is the area immediately behind the Speedway, as well as Klingberg. So Klingberg is that larger building behind it. Speedway is the one that's out towards Michigan Ave, and you can see the front of the Trinity Church just there. It's technically zoned D1, meaning it could be one of those blockier buildings that we just saw. But one of the reasons we identified this specific property, which is currently vacant and a small house, are that it might not be appropriate for that same type of building looked at right here, which is far more commercial mixed use. This is kind of the gateway to a neighborhood. If you continue down Harris, you're in the Pleasant Ridge area. It might be more appropriate to look at a product like the townhomes. That's probably what the market is going to demand if you look at what was built at Risden Heights. but just another point of consideration of what these buildings could potentially look like. These are a little bit taller than those built at Risden Heights, but it has, importantly, the parking tucked behind rather than in front. This is what a blockier building would look like, assuming that they'd provide parking on site, given the fact that there's not close proximity. Again, it might be more appropriate to look at a product like this than that, and perhaps looking at a zoning change and doing a swap with this one becoming D2 and then Gunther 1 becoming a D1 property. Again, looking at McKay and Hall Street, this is McKay, so this is immediately out that window to your right there, which might help you to visualize. Looking at a townhome development where the church currently owns property and some of these other single-family homes that don't have the same historic significance. You could obviously build something a lot denser than what's currently there. Each of those buildings could be 2 or 3 units. You're talking about a lot of new foot traffic and people potentially living downtown if these properties turn over. Again, just kind of showing scale versus what's currently there and what these properties would look like. You wouldn't notice that much of a change in my esteem. Those houses are about the same height. Again, it's a little bit denser. And that's pretty much it. So again, it's just looking at these conceptually. Do we like the spacing that we see? Do we like the heights? Do we think that the parking is appropriate for these types of uses? Beyond the Hall Street, McKay issue, the Henry Street, Harris intersection and the Gunther property, are there other areas within the downtown immediately that you think are warranting of higher density or rezoning? And then kind of any other critiques that you have of what could potentially be built in our downtown, kind of trying to change the code in preparation for new and renewed interest within our city. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions or comments?
Sure.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Is there, you mentioned that there was parking lots behind certain ones. Is there parking lots behind all of them?
So our code for the downtown, I do not believe currently requires parking. So some of it was shown as a matter of practicality, that likely if you're living in Saline where there are no real public transportation options, we have some microtransit with People's Express, you likely need to own a car. So a developer is not going to build a product for a person that doesn't exist.
That's the biggest thing I've heard since it's been on Facebook, and is the parking. The second is, when we have all the retail that's empty in Saline, why more retail? And then the third thing I've heard is, I've had a couple panicked people who live in houses that are in some of these areas say, you know, what are they doing? So I'm glad you buffered it tonight with your intro for doing that, because people were concerned once they saw it on Facebook.
Right, well, MLive did the subscriber exclusive lock, which kind of, you see the renderings, but you have no idea what's going on otherwise. So I have the MLive subscription, so it doesn't usually cross my mind, but I could see that as being a very real issue. So please communicate to those people. It's just an exercise. And then I go back to the comment I just made about parking, that a developer has an interest in renting the property that they make. Saline has a variety of systemic factors that are going to prevent people from living here without a car. I'm fortunate enough to be able to do it, but I share a car with my wife now, so it's not a big deal because I walk to work every day. But other people don't have that luxury. Most people who live in Saline do not work in Saline. Parking is going to have to be provided as a market necessity, and someone who's looking to live in a place where they're going to get one parking spot is likely not going to also own a bunch of recreational vehicles, an RV, a boat, a trailer, because there's no way for them to legally store it besides a self-storage facility. So I think sometimes we have to consider people's agency in choosing a housing product that works for them too, when we're talking about making really stringent parking requirements, which I don't think are shown here, but just maybe a point of consideration as developments come forward to the city in the future.
Have you looked at renderings with parking in the buildings as on a lower level?
I have not at this point in time, but Planner Auerbach and Chris Nordstrom, who prepared these renderings, could likely do that.
I think with most of these, we did put conceptual parking areas in the rear yard. The ordinance has some yard limitations that steer parking on site towards a side or rear yard, or at least require some screening, I think in the case of D2. But that is something that we could look at beefing up if you want more strict requirements about where off-street parking would go, if it has to be in a rear yard. If that's really what makes or breaks a building's compatibility with the surrounding area, we can certainly make those requirements a little more explicit.
And just, I wonder, it just feels like, you know, if you're thinking about like long-term, more impervious surfaces, all of the water issues, right? If we're thinking about like, could you put that, dig it and put it under the building for some of these buildings and have underground parking?
Sure, I think, that would always be an option. I'm not sure how we could represent that in a rendering if it was underneath the building, but it's certain, I mean, it's exponentially more expensive to build it underneath. I think appearance-wise, it may not make much of a difference, and I'm not sure that the renderings we would produce would look that much different, besides the structures you see here, just with the drive leading to an entryway to an underground parking area.
The 147 property, actually, when the Concanon project was presented, did have under-building parking because of that whole slope and the distance. So the topography, in some cases, actually benefits that type of parking.
I looked at that item very conceptually with Tyler Kinley, too, as he was considering expansion on Murphy's Crossing and what that would look like to potentially pull an access from the alley that they share with Salt. And it is a puzzle to put together. Thankfully, we're not so close to the water where that's not viable. It is viable. It is feasible. But it is a very high cost to a developer. It might make more sense for the Concanon property, 147, whatever we want to call it. It might make less sense for maybe a development on this street or on Hall Street where you're talking about probably a smaller number of units overall.
Mr. Herring, the one thing is, you and I have discussed, my concern is that limiting it to only 3 floors and some of the density restrictions that we have may make it, the cost feasibility, a big issue, and that even making smaller apartments and some of those type of things are one of the things that I would like to see happen. I just happened to notice on Packard, where there used to be a shopping center, they put in I don't know if it's 3 or almost 4-story building, and behind it is housing and whatever, but it doesn't look like it's out of place, surprisingly. And because it has these zero setbacks and things that we've talked about. So what I'm looking at is in certain areas, I just think that we have to consider those issues of either 4 to 5 floors, and then maybe even whether micro apartments or of that nature. And I do know one of the other things that was talked about was smaller homes. So even if you did something like the townhomes, whatever, can you produce something that's allows for maybe a 500 square foot home with very small footprints or something like that?
Yeah, so I would think in the latter example you just shared, it'd be more like a villages concept. So they would probably be, it's more like a condo at that point. Because likely you wouldn't want such an inefficient use of land in that respect for small, like a string of small homes unless they kind of use the lot more fully to develop a whole mini neighborhood, so to speak, of them. You'd probably want the height added that you mentioned to begin with there. The height is really what gives you the extra density. I will say our code is pretty progressive on downtown multifamily. It can't be on the ground floor. So to your point, Ms. Heft, that was one of the issues considered, or should potentially be one of the issues considered, is do we want multifamily standalone? It doesn't have to be a mixed-use product. It's a lot easier to convert residential to commercial than it is commercial to residential, which is something to maybe keep in mind when we're thinking about these properties too. But the height issue, I think, is probably key when you're looking at the villages. I will add, too, because it's been a misnomer kind of constantly shared in my 2-year tenure at the city. The city is able to accommodate a 55 or 60-foot building, even if we don't have a ladder truck necessarily able to accommodate that. There are other mechanisms, such as a standpipe, which provide fire service to those types of buildings. So it's not really a concern talking to the fire chief about the height of most of the structures in the city.
And just one other thing, as you'd mentioned that you had, Ms. Hess, that you had concerns about retail. I feel that downtown is missing out because the type of retail that's needed, those spaces aren't available, and they're going out to the shopping centers or want to spread out to that. So somehow we have got to add more desirable retail space that, even though we need to fill some of it, but we have to have spaces that would encourage it. We're at a point where there's just not enough space that will allow for an expansion to what we would like to have as a viable downtown. And so a combination of that. But I think there's more ways of doing it than just how we present it here. But
Right, absolutely. These are pretty standard ideas for what
I mean, that's exactly what we wanted, and I had asked for this because I think this is the issue, is this is somewhere to start. And we've had a lot of, inquiries about doing similar types of situations like this through town, and We just don't have anything to really say, yeah, do it. Because now I just saw Dexter's proposing something that's just got approved this week. We look at Chelsea and a number of these other ones, and we're behind the eight ball that we're not doing this. So whatever we can do to move this faster is what we need to make the downtown a more successful place.
I would just add to that last point. I think in particular, the proposal, or there's two counter proposals that have been presented this evening and at the most recent council meeting. Thank you, Ben, you read my mind. On 147 Michigan Avenue, I think the rendering that's on the screen is much more appropriate and advantageous for our community than the previous slide of exclusively residential with brownstones. I think a mixed use on that site that provided condo, apartment, loft living on a second, third, or potentially even fourth floor with retail, professional office, or restaurant, bar, boutique on the ground level would be ideal. And I think Mr. Gearbaugh articulated it quite well. There's certain spaces and amenities that are not existent, that are deficient in downtown, and I think in particular the redevelopment or development of that site would eliminate a number of those. And boy, if we could get some traction on that particular parcel, it would be great.
Anything else? And then number 2, Community Development Department update.
Yeah, so this is something I've gotten a decent amount of practice saying. I got a job offer with the city of Little Canada, Minnesota, which I accepted. I will be leaving the city of Saline. It's been a real pleasure to work with you all for the last 2 years, but my last day with the city will be August 9th.
We will miss you.
I will miss you all, too.
Thank you for your hard work that you've done over the last 2 years, so we will miss you.
Thank you.
And City Council will be talking about a transition plan at our next City Council meeting, which will be the first Monday in August, I believe, the 5th. Mr. Harrington and the city manager and I met to discuss it on Monday, and I think we have some great ideas, and there'll be something substantive to share publicly at that time.
And I believe the position is up and posted, not to say, Ben, that, we're not saying it, but it is up, and we're recruiting for his transition person.
And here there's a former city employee who might be interested in applying for the position.
Yeah, I got, Mr. Harrington, you were gracious enough to provide an update to my office and City Council, but I inquired, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago about the status of the former UAW Local 892 parcel there at Maple and Woodland. Can you provide an update? I'm not sure if you've garnered any additional information from when you last reached out, but 1, the status of when they expect to begin construction activity, and 2, when some of the code infractions on site will be resolved.
So I believe we've noticed the code infractions, and they should be getting resolved in the next week or so. I can verify that tomorrow morning. As for the completion of the building, I believe he said they were going to get underway and then probably in August, and then hopefully have it pretty much completed in September, October. I would have to look at the context of the email I sent you. It's been a few moments since I reviewed that issue.
Just so the Planning Commission is aware. And again, he's got a year as of the execution, or excuse me, the approval of his final site plan, or their final site plan.
Right, and they have pulled building permits, so they're on track to do it. I think there was just some delays with their contractor, which is not unusual in this day and age.
Which reminds me, Ben, I was going to send you a picture, whatever, but the abandoned car wash, and there's a number of just signs and things that are laying down on the ground. They haven't mowed between the shopping center and the car wash. The grass is at least 2 feet tall. I took pictures, I was going to send it, but since we're talking about it.
Yeah, please, and we are in the process of also addressing that issue. I met with a potential dangerous buildings official, which I've already notified the property owner of, so if they're listening, I was serious. So we are moving forward. There are a couple of procedural things that are going to take some time to iron out because the city has not ever had a dangerous buildings official, but that's what our code requires. But it's a way to expedite this issue to ensure that the property is either brought to compliance, given a certificate of occupancy, which would be quite the feat given the age of the property and the gutting of the wiring in the building, or they'll have to demolish it. There's not really much of an in-between there. So they have 2 options, or they could sell it and have somebody else develop it, which would be wonderful news for everyone involved too. So really trying to move the issue forward on that specific property.
So just as you mentioned that, so if the property is sold, can any kind of conditions be put on it that it would transition? I'd hate to see it move to another person and then sit there and nothing happened to it.
Well, so the code is about the structure itself. So regardless if it goes to somebody else, the issue will still stand. The building has to be brought to a point and issued a certificate of occupancy. or it needs to be demolished. You can't just leave a vacant structure for 20 years, which is exactly what's happened. So it's trying to ameliorate that issue.
Anything else?
Do we expect to have a meeting on the 14th?
Yes, we do. So there was the acquisition and the annexation of the Waterworks Ann Arbor property. So there is a preliminary PUD application. We've already set that in motion. It's out for review to Carlisle, Wortman, and OHM. So there will be a
Ready by the
meeting on the 14th.
Yeah, if there isn't a, I mean, I'm more concerned that it be thoroughly reviewed and confirmed, so if it doesn't make it on the 14th, considering your position will not.
I've already worked with the city manager on that issue specifically. We're meeting tomorrow with Carlisle Wortman, with Mike and Ben to talk about what that transition looks like. But ultimately, I think they had a pretty thorough submittal. So I think if nothing else, it's time to critique. It'll be very similar to maybe 207 Monroe, where we accepted there were deficiencies. We asked them to come back and you postpone action. So that is one valid option too, but to give the applicant more time to know what you're thinking, so they can make some of those changes ahead of time before it gets to the final PUD phase.
Is there a motion on the table to adjourn at 8:13?
I'll move to adjourn.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? No. Motion passes. Have a great night.
Do we have to sign the site plan?
Yeah, we're behind on that, so we'll take care of that.
Subsequent meeting?
You're likely, yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Danica.
Thank you so much.